Hey, it's Joel. We kind of have a special treat for you this week on the podcast. We were looking through some of our old files on our computer and found a recording we had done a few years ago and decided to release it because it's a good recording. Talked about some interesting topics and it's from the archives. We thought, well, this is a shame just to let this go to waste. So that's what we're doing this week. This is a little bit of an older podcast that's been released now, so it's kind of interesting to hear us back in the day before some of the audio equipment and some of the, I would call it, polish that we've developed in the last few years. So enjoy this podcast from the archives. Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And in this podcast, I want to read an essay that I got out of the book called This Will Make You Smarter, which is it's like a collection of essays from the world's, well, what this book and edge.org considers to be the world's most influential thinkers. And they were all asked the question, what scientific concept would improve everybody's cognitive toolkit? So the whole book has been really interesting. These essays are pretty short. They're like a couple pages. I think some of them were like 3 or 4 pages at the most. And I found the whole book to be really interesting. But when I caught this one, I mean, it's short enough to read on a podcast, and I think it has a powerful enough idea. Actually, it's something I think that we talk about a lot. Yeah. And I thought it was good enough to read and discuss the concept of. The essay is from Catherine Schultz, who's a journalist, and she's the writer of a book called Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error. The essay is entitled The Pessimistic, Meta-Induction from the History of Science. And this is how it starts out. She says, okay, it's a terrible phrase. In my defense, I didn't coin it. Philosophers of science have been kicking it around for a while. But if the pessimistic meta-induction from the history of science is cumbersome to say and difficult to remember, it is also a great idea. In fact, as the meta part suggests, it's the kind of idea that puts all other ideas into perspective. Here's the gist. Because so many scientific theories from bygone eras have turned out to be wrong, we must assume that most of today's theories will eventually prove incorrect as well. And what goes for science goes in general. Politics, economics, technology, law, religion, medicine, child rearing, education. No matter the domain of life, one's generation's verities so often become the next generation's falsehoods that we might as well have a pessimistic meta-induction from the history of everything. Good scientists understand this. They recognize that they are part of a long process of approximation. They know they are constructing models rather than revealing reality. They are comfortable working under conditions of uncertainty, not just the local uncertainty of, will this data bear out my hypothesis, but the sweeping uncertainty of simultaneously pursuing and being cut off from absolute truth. The rest of us, by contrast, often engage in a kind of tacit chronological exceptionalism. Unlike all those suckers who fell for the flat earth or the geocentric universe or cold fusion, we ourselves had the great good luck to be alive during the very apex of accurate human thought. The literary critic Harry Levin put this nicely. The habit of equating one's age with the apogee of civilization, one's town with the hub of the universe, one's horizons with the limits of human awareness is paradoxically widespread. At best, we nurture the fantasy that knowledge is always cumulative, and therefore concede that future eras will know more than we do. But we ignore or resist the fact that knowledge collapses as often as it accretes, that our own most cherished beliefs might appear patently false to posterity. That fact is the essence of meta-induction. And yet, despite its name, the idea is not pessimistic. Or rather, it is pessimistic only if you hate being wrong. If, by contrast, you think that uncovering your mistakes is one of the best ways to revise and improve your understanding of the world, then this is actually a highly optimistic insight. The idea behind the meta-induction is that all of our theories are fundamentally provisional and quite possibly wrong. If we can add that idea to our cognitive toolkit, we will be better able to listen with curiosity and empathy to those whose theories contradict our own. We will be better able to pay attention to counter evidence, those anomalous bits of data that make our picture of the world a little weirder, more mysterious, less clean, less done. And we will be able to hold our own beliefs a bit more humbly, in the happy knowledge that better ideas are almost certainly on the way.
What a great essay. And it kind of gets to the heart of what we talk about a lot on this podcast and in all of the programs and trainings that we do. which is this idea that we're working with models. These are some of the best tools we have. These are maps and models to understand reality, to understand personality type, to understand your personal growth as a person. But we don't want to be married to any one perspective, one model, one way of seeing or doing things. And this really illustrates that mature thinking is that you've got a working model for something, but you're holding to it loosely to the point where you can be malleable. You can mold that and shape it to new information that comes out, or maybe a better model and replace it if it comes. And that flexibility really opens up the opportunity for growth for you.
Yeah, this assumption that we somehow have it all figured out and everybody in history was just a bunch of dopes.
Yeah.
Right? Like, well, they all were wrong, but now we know.
Yeah. Well, I think of medical profession. Back in the 1700s, I think the first president of the United States, George Washington, died because they were practicing bloodletting, where if you had an illness, they would cut your wrist or your arm and let blood drain out of you in order to remove the poisons from your body or the illness from your body. And now that's ridiculous. You're actually removing blood from somebody. You could obviously kill them. That's how George Washington died. And now we don't do that anymore. We have different ways of treating illnesses. But at the time, that was like the highest medical research and advancement for its day.
Yeah, well, not only are you bleeding somebody, but you also are not addressing what's actually doing damage. So you're doubling up on the problem. I mean, there's so many of those things right now going on that we don't know that they're happening. I'm wondering what sorts of things. I always wonder, like, in 300 to 500 years, what in the history book is going to reference our time period, and people are going to be like, dude, they were total barbarians. like that. They
ate fast food. Can you believe what they put in their bodies?
Yeah.
That fast food hamburgers? Oh my gosh.
Yeah, well, and just the way that we go about so many different things as like normal, like this is just normal for us.
Yeah.
And we assume we're at, like the essay mentioned, the very apex of human enlightenment and knowledge. And we look in the past and we're like, yeah, those people were doofuses because they didn't know something that's very obvious to us. I think we have a tendency to have a bias about how much credit we take also for the innovations of the time. Mm-hmm. We over-identify with whatever is the latest and greatest technology or knowledge or information of our time period. We over-identify with it to a point where we think that somehow we created it, as opposed to just we just happened to be born during this time period. So we over-attach to these ideas as if they're ours, and then we can't allow them to be at all questioned. And really, this concept of, taking a meta perspective, zooming out, looking at how it has always played out in the past, which is the knowledge of the time becomes the misinformation of the future. Always. I mean, there are some things that have remained consistent, but for the most part, when it comes to things like science and medicine, etc., they're like whatever we decide is the absolute empirical, truth now almost invariably becomes non-truth later. And I love that she pointed out, like, if that's the case in science, how much more so? I mean, she didn't say how much more so, but I always think how much more so in all these other fields, right? Because science actually has a rigor about it that requires people to follow very specific guidelines in order to be accepted into the community. Most other communities do not have those rigorous guidelines. There was a quote I read in a book that said scientific progress happens one funeral at a time.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. And they were referencing how, like, Einstein's concepts were never truly accepted or very rarely accepted by the scientists of his time period or the physicists of his time period. It wasn't until after that entire generation of physicists died that they started to become adopted and expanded upon and really understood. And they said I think it was that book that said, if that's the case in science, how much more so is it in every other field where you don't have the same rigorous standards?
Yeah.
So we have this, this combination of whatever information we have right now is almost certainly going to be wrong in some capacity, combined with the tightness that we hold on to these concepts and usually do not allow, the concepts themselves don't flourish until a generation of people die because they'll never let it go.
I guess I take the viewpoint that in her essay, she was saying that, information breaks down as much as it builds upon itself. And I don't know if I completely agree with that stance. I mean, I think of the maps, maps from the 1500s, 1400s, when people were starting to explore, North America, the entire population, the entire planet. some of our maps were very crude. The coastline of the United States and Canada was crudely sketched in by what they were interpreting. If you look at some of those old maps, they're pretty crude, but they got the landmass pretty accurate. I mean, the map was fairly accurate. Its portrayal of, okay, there's a giant landmass here, and the major, like, large brushstrokes of how the land curved and things like that, it's still pretty accurate to maps today that we have satellite imagery to verify. So I think with her saying that information collapses, or there was a word she used specifically, I don't remember the exact word in that essay, but I think information just continually refines itself. And I guess that map is useless from the 1500s, right? We can't use that map to navigate a cross-country Atlantic Ocean trip from England to the United States now, because it just doesn't give the accuracy there. But you can see the starting point, the rough sketches of our current maps today. And so I think that's really what, in my opinion, is happening with information, is we have these kind of almost intuitive leaps, almost like sketches of what we think is over on this side of the quote-unquote planet, or the map we're looking at, or the scientific discovery, the medical institution, whatever. And we've got kind of a rough idea, and then we refine it over time as we get more information to add to that. We make changes, it morphs, it evolves. It's more of an evolution than a dissolution of information and how things progress.
Yeah, well, and I think she mentioned that in the essay, that's the best way to look at it. I mean, excuse me, that is... At best, that is the reality. At best, it's that we build on previous information and refine it. That's at best. At worst, the information completely collapses. And, you know, I as you were talking, I was thinking about things like astronomy, too, and how star mapping has remained ridiculously accurate for so long. Mm-hmm. And at the same time...
Almost better than our planet mapping.
Yeah.
We have a better perspective, probably.
Well, that makes sense because we're viewing it from a distance, and it remains the same. So I think things like anything that's concrete, right? Anything that's concrete that doesn't go away, like landmass. I mean, landmass obviously changes over time, but it takes a long time to change. And the stars don't really change that much, or they do, but it takes a very long time to change. Basically, in like the 5,000 or so years that we've been time-binding information and writing it down and passing it on, 5,000 years is not really long enough to see, you know, the stars radically alter. It's not long enough to see, you know, the landmass that we've been mapping radically alter. So I think with things like that are very concrete, I do agree that we build on and refine that information because it was very concrete to begin with. I think a lot of the things that we're dealing with right now, a lot of the challenges that we face in the world are less concrete than they are abstractions. They're challenges that are based on things that are very changing. Like, how do we deal with, you know, human suffering? Or how do we deal with poverty? Or how do we deal with hunger? Or how do we deal, you know, like the big challenges really that we think about, like, if I was going to save the world, this is what I would do. A lot of those are not concrete, right? Like, I mean, I guess it's concrete to put food in people's bellies, but why food is not going in people's bellies changes. Those are, you know, we talked about before in our podcast on systems thinking. We talked about emergent properties of systems, right? And the nodes in the system of things like poverty and the nodes in the system of things like, you know, homelessness or, you know, malnutrition or, you know, oppression from governments or whatever, those nodes change over time because socially and, you know, our evolutionary psychology changes over time. So I think that's why with a lot of those kinds of ideas and concepts, you have to assume that that piece of information is going to collapse because the very foundation of the information itself alters and changes. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, when it comes to things that are very concrete, I agree. I think that we do tend to refine and build on and become better and better in our knowledge of those pieces of information. But I think a lot of the, you know, quote unquote problems that we face or the challenges we face, I think a lot of that information can collapse. And so the assumption that you've got the answer, I think that's really the point. The assumption that you have the ultimate answer. And if everybody just listened to you, everybody, you know, everything would be fine. And that you have, you know, ultimate best perspective on the reality of, you know, how everything happens and how it goes. I think that's the hubris, or that's the arrogance that each generation, not just us as individuals, but I think generationally, we make that assumption that, you know, that we're at the apex of information and we know how to solve everything. Even if those things are not being solved, we assume that if people would just listen to us, right, If they would just like, we have a group and the group has come up with that, whether that's a religion or whether that's like a, representation group or whatever. And we just know what the answer is. And one of the most profound ideas that come from essays like this, because I read a lot of essays like that. What I really liked about it is that it was short and sweet. But I read a lot of stuff that basically is like, hey, so hold loosely to your ideas and concepts because there's no real, you don't really know. Is this idea of being comfortable with uncertainty. I think that's what it comes down to. I think for me and my personal development, especially as an ENTP in the Myers-Briggs system, as an ENTP, for me, my personal development comes from developing my co-pilot process. And if you've gone to Personality Hacker, we have a whole article written on what the CAR model is. And the CAR model is effectively the mental processes that are in each Myers-Briggs personality type's CAR. We call it the CAR model because it's basically these mental processes that your personality is most influenced by. And as an ENTP, my growth state in that CAR model, it's called the co-pilot position, is a process that's technically called introverted thinking, but we call it accuracy. And when I was doing the highest leverage personal development, like the thing that really got me to the next level and that I still continue to try to refine, is this process called introverted thinking, which is really about seeking truth, right? Like it's really about having answers. It's about collecting massive amounts of data and being able to figure out what makes logical and analytical sense. And then, really being able to understand how things work. And I think the moment that I hit the greatest level of development in that time period of that phase, this is about 4 or 5 years ago, I was studying a lot of philosophy and formal logic and math and that kind of thing. And it was this moment where I realized that while I love an elegant thought and an elegant solution, if it's truly elegant, I'm probably shoehorning, right? The more elegant the concept is or the thought is, the more it's just a model. It's just an easy model for understanding reality, and it is not reality because nothing in reality has a complete, elegant answer to everything. And so it was this moment of going, oh, I'm going to have to live with uncertainty. I'm going to have to live with collecting information, collecting data, trying to figure out what makes sense to me, and having no idea whether or not it's true.
Yeah.
And so that's really, I think, the point of the essay, is being comfortable with uncertainty.
As we're talking about this, you're listening, and you're probably an intuitive. We've talked about being an intuitive before on podcasts. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but what it means is that you have a learning preference for pattern recognition. You like to see what's behind the curtain. So you're probably an intuitive and you're listening with us and you love the conversation because it's very intuitive focused. And one of the things that comes up for me, I find a lot of people doubling down on what they believe is the right course of action. They get the map and the territory mistaken and they're like, well, I'm at the highest echelon of understanding and I know the right answer. I have a tendency to go the opposite direction. I always have. Is to not be able to come down on anything. I'm too freeform. I'm too much up in the air. I hold things too loosely, and it causes me to want to just learn, and I can't get to a decision point, or I can't make judgments because I know the nature of reality is shifting all the time. I know that, not the nature of reality, but my interpretation of the nature of reality is shifting. I mean, I kind of have this belief that I can't know anything for sure, and so sometimes that can be extremely crippling on the other end. And if you're intuitive listening, that might be something you're dealing with, is you have the sense that, well, nothing's really steady, so I just have to keep learning and keep growing, and I can't ever really decide on something or move forward. And that has been something in my life that I've really had to learn, is this balance between the two. Oftentimes people might have this challenge of, I want to be right. I want to see things in this way, and everything's locked down, and they need to be loosened up. But then there's this other end where someone's so loose and free form that they almost need to just pick a model and run with it just for the sake of getting on in life. Like, I just need to assume gravity is real, and like I do, and be able to walk around on the floor and outside and not question it all the time. And that's an extreme example. I don't question the nature of gravity. That's a model that seems to bear out in reality. But, however, there are other things I'm just questioning all the time, and it cripples me from getting on in life or getting to the next level or growing sometimes. And so I think that it's particularly the people that lead with the process of intuition, whether it's introverted intuition or extroverted intuition, which are both technical terms. For nicknames, we've called perspectives and exploration. if you're leading with those two learning styles in your personality, then you might spin your wheels a lot. And that can be something you also need to think about. And I know I have as well.
We haven't talked about this before the podcast. So this is an idea that's just coming up for me as we're talking. I wonder if that's also being uncomfortable with uncertainty.
Maybe.
Like both of them, like this holding on too tightly to what you believe.
Or too loosely.
Is a fear of uncertainty, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like you have to force that you are certain about this because you fear uncertainty, or not being able to take an action, right? Because what if it's wrong is also a fear of uncertainty. I wonder if both are a fear of uncertainty. I wonder if...
Different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, like if you can get to a point where you go, look, I'm not going to be able to know. So you just rest into making an assumption, right? Or like going with the best information at the time. We've actually talked about this just to kind of go like a little postmodern on this podcast. We've talked about how much talking I do in the podcast.
Yeah.
And how it's, and I say things as if I know them to be true, and I say them in like this really assertive way. And most of the time I think I'm totally full of it, right? Like I've even admitted to people that I'll like lay down in bed on my pillow at night and just think, man, I am so full of shit. And here people are like listening to the podcast and taking notes. I'm like, man, I don't know anything. And then I go, yeah, but I don't really have to know that I know. I don't have to be certain. I just have to do my best to be valuable. I have to do my best to try to relay useful concepts.
Sure.
Nobody has to believe that I know anything empirically. I don't have to know. I just have to go, look, this has been really useful in my life. The more I head down this road, the better I feel, the happier I am, the more successful I become. And so here are some of the models that have really served me. Mm-hmm. And you can take them or leave them. You're going to find your own models. And here's how people find models. I think it's more like most of the time that I package information and quote unquote sell it. Well, not even quote unquote sell it. I actually sell information. That's what I do that's what we do for a business.
Advice.
Yeah, we sell advice. And invariably this is how people choose models. Here are some models that I've loved and have been super useful to me. Here's how I've utilized models. These models might not be great for you. That's why we always say, with like, especially with Myers-Briggs, which is the bread and butter of our business is Myers-Briggs. If Myers-Briggs isn't working for you, throw it out the window, right? Find a different model that works better for you. That's totally fine. Here's how models work. And I don't feel a sense of certainty about any specific model, but I do, I guess I would call it faith. I do have faith that when you utilize models, it's an easier way of navigating the world. And so I think that's making peace with uncertainty doesn't mean that you automatically decide that you can't know anything to be true. You can't, but that's okay. It's like, you don't assume that that you have nothing to offer. Because if that was the case, nobody would have anything to offer, right? Like idea exchange would be meaningless and valueless. If we only could share things we were certain about, then since none of us can be certain about anything, then none of us would have anything to share, except for the people who have doubled down on certainty and they're wrong. Yeah. Right? So like those would be the only people who have anything to share. So I guess that's sort of, what you're talking about, which is this like on one side, you're just so sure you're right and you become very narrow-minded and you can't be open to any argument. And, that's one side of the pendulum. And all the way over on the other side is like, you can't know anything to be true at all ever. So you just sit there in analysis paralysis and you can't take any steps. And I think the middle ground is holding loosely to your concepts, looking for the things that have served you, sharing those things with other people, getting them to share with you, cross-pollinating what has served us, building skill in map making, building skill in forming models, and then being okay if those models don't play out. Like being okay with life being a constant test iterate, and then just figuring out what's worked for you and, slightly adjusting course when you realize that I don't think this is making me happy. And I think maybe that's why the litmus test for me is always happiness.
Yeah, I think having something that this all leads toward, like we always use the phrase the magnet in the middle of the field, or the thing that you're ultimately kind of navigating toward, right? One of the things that I would say, just to kind of reiterate this, is I think when we go through the world, we're looking for the answer. We're looking for this idea of truth with a capital T, or the answer or the solution to reality or life or religion or politics or medicine or whatever. We're looking for the answer, right? The truth of what's the best thing or the truthful thing. And I think a better way to look at this, and you really hinted at this just a moment ago, is don't look at truth, look at usefulness. Look at any map or model as a tool for usefulness, and the usefulness towards some end. And you're saying that your metric is happiness. I would say my metric is happiness as well. And and then you can expand that from just my own personal happiness to the people in my sphere, my immediate sphere's happiness, and then my community or my country or my place I live, and then the entire world would be expanding that frame, like happiness for everyone on the planet Earth. And this is a great, that's one that we've chosen as kind of our metric to how we measure the usefulness of a model, is the measurement of happiness. And we obviously have our own interpretation. Your interpretation of happiness is much different than mine. So there's no quote unquote truth with a capital T here. It's that you're trying to create happiness in how you define it. I'm trying to create happiness in how I define it. And we're using maps and models as tools, as means to an end, not as trying to find truth or like a status of reality in a sense. It's a way to move through reality. Just like a pair of shoes you'd put on. Well, it's snowing outside, I'll put snow boots on, or it's a nice day, I'll put flip-flops on. It's a tool depending on the context you're in, but both are trying to get me to my end goal of walking somewhere. Walking somewhere is my end goal. That's the magnet in the middle of the field. That's the metric I'm using, is to be able to walk somewhere over gravel and rough roads. It doesn't really matter what shoes I use as long as they work for me. So I think that's how I really think about this. And I think that, again, is difficult to swallow. It would have been difficult for me to swallow 5-10 years ago, that I'm not looking for truth, I'm looking for usefulness. And that was a very difficult concept at that time for me. But having thought about this a lot and moved through and used maps and models, I've thrown some out, I've adopted some, I've really doubled down on a few maps and models that I think work really great, like personality psychology. And I've played with these, and I've found a lot that have been useful for me to create happiness in my life. So that's kind of how I would encapsulate looking at this as a frame.
Yeah. There is a skill to building comfort with uncertainty. And I think having something else as your goal is probably the best way to build that muscle. Like we both talked about happiness. One of my mentors recently, in like an interview I heard with him, talked about, I think it's a Latin word. I don't remember. It could be Latin. Who knows? But the word hilaritas, which sounds Latin, so I'm going to pretend like it's Latin. Hilaritas is the root word for the English word hilarity. But effectively, it means cheerfulness, right? Like kind of that, almost what the French would call joie de vivre. It's like a sense of cheerfulness.
Uh-huh.
And he mentioned that hilaritas was his, I mean, he didn't call it the magnet in the middle of the field, but basically hilaritas was his goal, right? Like cheerfulness, basically. And so he said, if people say, what's the meaning of life? He's like, I don't know, have some fun, do some good, have a little fun.
Do a little good.
Do a little good.
Get down tonight. Get down tonight.
So I thought, man, that's so great, because it's not this big epic. And this is not a dumb man by any stretch of the imagination. This is a man who his entire life was highly sought after for his concepts on philosophy and on psychology and social psychology. I mean, the man was brilliant. And he encapsulated it with hilaritas, cheerfulness. Mm-hmm. He's like, that was his litmus test. If he was getting away from cheerfulness, then he was on the wrong path. And I thought cheerfulness was almost better than happiness. Because happiness...
It seems like an end rather than a means to something.
Right, whereas cheerfulness feels like a state of being. I guess happiness is a state of being too, but cheerfulness is like, you have markers to cheerfulness. How do you know if somebody's cheerful? They're smiling, and they usually are really good with banter, or they enjoy playing with other people. It's very playful. Right, so it's not just happiness, it's like happiness and playfulness together.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that concept. So right now, everything is being refined into the emergent, for me, of hilaritas, right? Cheerfulness. And if I can maintain a feeling of cheerfulness, I know that this is probably a pretty good model that I'm in. in the podcast we did on rules, right? And we talked about Tony Robbins in the book Awaken the Giant Within. We talked about his personal rules concept, and that for him, the number one most important rule is always have fun no matter what you're doing. That's a very similar concept. So these people who are profoundly influential and very impactful are basically saying, when you refine it down, it's about fun and cheerfulness and happiness. And we lose sight of that. In fact, I think we've been so indoctrinated through this concept of that, like, life is suffering and you've got to push through it. And if you're experiencing pleasure, that's somehow sinful or wrong. We've really attached this concept of pleasure with sinfulness. What if that's just a really unhappy model? What if that's a model that has its own results, and it's not any more or less true than any other model, and it's a model that's encouraging you to never feel pleasure, right? It's a model that's not encouraging you to be happy or be cheerful. Is that a very useful model? Well, it's not a model that I really want, not anymore. I had that model for a long time. I doubled down on that map for a very long time, and now I'm like, wow, what a waste of time. So at this point, those are my litmus tests: happiness, cheerfulness, hilaritas, fun. Why not? Right? Why not pleasure? Why not? And it has definitely helped with success, like all sorts of success, relationship success, monetary success. The more you have this quality, people are just magnetically attracted to you. They want what you have, because I personally believe that everybody instinctively knows that that's what we want to go towards. When we're around somebody who's just feels endlessly cheerful and happy, man, those people are so wonderful to be around.
Yeah.
So I think it's the key. I really do. But at the same time, I'll hold that loosely too. I don't know that to be true. I just, I'm uncertain about that as well. And yet it's been very useful for me. So it's a map that right now I'm doubling down on.
Well, my perspective is I like being happy, so I want other people to be happy. Maybe their goal is to be miserable, and they like to construct their life that way, but I don't know if I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of the people in the world that want to be happy themselves as well, because that's kind of what I want for everyone. So that's kind of how I go with. Not kind of, that's how I go with it.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say really quick, this whole conversation could be encapsulated in that one question that you and I ask ourselves all the time. We picked it up from someone else. And that question is, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And for a lot of people, that feels like a false dichotomy. They'll say, well, why not both? It's not really an overarching, you get to choose one or the other, right? Like the question is not like you get to be either right or you get to be happy. So you have to choose the two.
And it may not be a meta question. It's more of like in the moment question.
It's an in the moment. If I'm really holding tight to being right and it is at the cost of happiness, is that really what I want? Or would I prefer happiness over being right in this moment? And I think this whole conversation is basically like, you and I have chosen happiness. Not always, though. There are moments when we choose right. Like, I'm just so totally sure that I am right in this perspective, and I will fight you, and here I am breaking down in tears and like miserable, and then it will dawn on me, man, I hate how I feel right now. So why am I so holding tightly to this concept of being right? Why don't I just let that go? Why do I have to be right? If I cannot be right and I can be happy instead, well, that seems like a really good trade. So I'm just going to stop trying to be right, and I'm going to choose happiness instead.
One of the great places to do this is if you're ever in a spat with your lover or your spouse or a close friend or relative, and you're in the middle of that argument or that disagreement. If you can create a little mental trigger in your mind as you want to be right about your perspective in this disagreement, for you to stop as soon as the trigger goes off in your brain, to say, do I want to be right or do I want to be happy, and evaluate that disagreement in light of that question, it really reframes how you approach that disagreement or that discussion or whatever the tension is between you and that other person. It's a great place to practice. If that's something that you're interested in doing, it's a great place to practice doing that. I try to do that in any disagreements I have with people, and often, I have to humble myself and not be right in the situation. And ultimately, it does create happiness. It creates understanding, and this is something I've had to learn. This is not natural to us as humans to want to just let our egos die a little bit in order for the sake of happiness to be the case. So that's just an encouragement of a little exercise, if you can put that trigger into your brain.
Definitely. So what do you think? Would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? Do you need certainty? What is it? What do you experience when you think about living in a world where you can't experience certainty?
Are you the person that doubles down, or are you the person that's always in like free form? I can never know for sure, so I'm never going to take any course of action.
And if you have, models or exercises that have served you in order to increase your happiness, your hilaritas, your cheerfulness, and you want to share them, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
We would love to get those different, modalities shared amongst the community.
If you go over to facebook.com/personality hacker or twitter.com/personality hack, HACK, you can share those with the community. It's a growing community of like minds just like you who would love to, engage and talk about this. We've got discussions running on both social network platforms. We also, on the website, of course, personalityhacker.com, under the podcast, if you leave some notes, there's discussion happening there as well. And just come over and make yourself known, introduce yourself, be part of the community. We want to build a community of like minds more than anything else that we do. That's really important to us, for you to be a part of this discussion on a regular basis.
And if you love our podcast, please rate us on iTunes. It makes me feel warm and squishy. You have talked about that before. Please make me feel warm and squishy by rating us on iTunes. You have to be logged in, but it's actually not that difficult. So even if you don't want to leave feedback, just go ahead and rate us. Let us know how we're doing if you want to leave feedback. And that would be absolutely wonderful.
And hit the subscribe button while you're logged in there, so you can get us every week. We can be part of your weekly, commute or workout at the gym or whatever.
Oh, somebody told us recently that they lost 15 pounds because they hate going for walks, but they're now listening to our podcast on their walks, and they have now lost 15 pounds. So, Personality Hacker, your weight loss system.
That's awesome. What a great tagline.
I know.
You'll lose 15 pounds in 15 minutes or less with Personality Hacker.
That's right. No, never 15 minutes. Are you kidding me? We're too chatty for 15 minutes or less.
Hey, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dye.
This has been the Personality Hacker Podcast. We'll talk to you on the next episode.